Thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors by Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, I'm sure, is already known to many, if not all of you, as one of our nation's preeminent legal analysts. A former prosecutor turned journalist, he's been covering legal affairs for The New Yorker since 1993 and has appeared frequently on TV, starting in the mid-1990s for ABC and then shifting in 2002 to CNN, where he serves as chief legal analyst. He's also written 7 previous books on subjects ranging from the inner workings of the Supreme Court to some of the most prominent legal cases over the past few decades, including the prosecution of Oliver North in the Iran-Contra scandal, the O.J. Simpson murder trial, the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal, the legal battle over the 2000 presidential election results, and the kidnapping and trial of Patty Hearst. So it's fitting that Jeffrey, in his new book, decided to apply his formidable analytic and narrative skills to the 2 biggest legal stories of Donald Trump's presidency, the Robert Mueller investigation and the impeachment effort. Drawing on lots of interviews with many of those involved, Jeffrey was able to come up with fresh insider details about these historic proceedings. His depictions of key players like Mueller and Rudy Giuliani are revealing, and the way he weaves together so many twists and turns is, as a New York Times reviewer put it, absorbing and fast-paced. But what Jeffrey arguably does best in the book, as he does so often in his magazine journalism and on-air commentary, is provide an authoritative, clear-minded, and insightful assessment. In this instance, an assessment of what was and wasn't accomplished by these huge investigations and why, in the end, they failed to topple Trump. Said an NPR reviewer, Jeffrey has gathered such a weight of evidence and such a chorus of witnesses that his summation is more damning than the sum of its parts. And you'll hear just how damning it is in a minute. In conversation with Jeffrey this evening will be another great journalist, Carol Leonnig of the Washington Post. Carol has worked at the Post for 20 years, won a Pulitzer 3 times for stories she's done either on her own or as a part of a team, and nowadays serves as an investigative reporter focused on the White House and government accountability. In fact, she and her colleague, Phil Rucker, earlier this year came out with a terrific book, A Very Stable Genius, about Trump's first 3 years. So Jeffrey and Carol, the screen is yours.
Brad, thank you for that lovely introduction of this amazing author. I'm so excited to be here tonight with Jeff Toobin, somebody whose work I've followed as a young journalist and who dug as deep as you can go into 2 investigations that I covered myself for the Washington Post. So it was a treat, Jeff, to read your book on my porch, socially distanced from everyone, and to learn a little bit about something that I really did feel quite an expert on. Welcome all of you Politics and Prose remote folks. We're glad that you're here and we're glad you're reading, because this is a piece of history, this book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors, and I think you're gonna really enjoy the conversation tonight, or at least I hope that I will draw some news out of this in addition to the wonderful news that was made in the book. Jeff, first, I'm going to be the nerd that I am and say that your book's a fascinating read. You take us behind the scenes in this decision-making in one and now 2 of the most momentous investigations of a president in our generation. And some people would say, at least in one instance, in our history of democracy. These were a dominant piece of the Trump presidency. They shadowed him. They will follow him forever. And they revealed a lot about the man. I guess I want to start again with the journalist question. What did you find in your research that was the most shocking, the most surprising? Because you are a good journalist who's pretty hardened and likely cynical. But what surprised you?
Well, first of all, Kara, let me show how much I've learned about politics by being a politician and not answering your question. And say, first of all, just what a pleasure it is to be here. Brad, thank you. And Carol, how much I have admired your work in the Post for so many years, whether you were torturing the Secret Service or covering the Trump White House. And in the book that you wrote with Phil Rucker, A Very Stable Genius, was so good and so it was joyful in many respects because it was so unsparing in exposing the craziness of the Trump White House. And I also thought sort of an interesting counterpoint and bookend in a way to my own, because though we covered some of the same material, I mean, you do have very good stuff about the Mueller investigation, mostly from the perspective of the White House. It's really sort of what's going on in the White House other than the scandal management that's the core of your book. And I found it so fascinating to read, to sort of see what else was going on, because I was so focused on Mueller and then later Ukraine. But now finally, to answer your question of like, what did I find most shocking? I'm gonna sort of I'm gonna drop a name that I don't use. I mean, I had a conversation with Barack Obama right towards the end of his term. It was at a wedding. It was not at but
Oh,
Trump had
you
been
and the
elected.
president at a wedding.
Yeah,
Yeah, go
I mean,
on.
it was a weird encounter. I had interviewed him once, but I don't want to pretend that I knew him. And I said, well, what do you think? What do you think's going to happen? And he said, well, every president brings a new set of policies, and I'm not going to agree with a lot of the policies, but that's just sort of the way the things go. What you need to watch is for the norms, the unwritten rules that have been followed by presidents and White Houses of through both parties, and see if they continue to be followed. And I guess so much has happened in the Trump presidency, but the constant thing we always see is that this president has no respect for the traditions, the norms, the customs of how presidents and to a certain extent human beings behave, whether it's the constant lying, the abuse of adversaries and in his case subordinates. And if you look at both the Mueller investigation and what went on with Ukraine, I think it is sometimes difficult to pigeonhole precisely what law the president violated, though I think he did violate some laws, particularly when it came to obstruction of justice. But just the complete disregard and ignorance of the customs of how presidents of the United States have behaved and should behave, that to me is the thing that never fails to amaze me. Going up to yesterday, when the president, talked about how, Joe Biden hates God and hates religion. I mean, nobody's talked that way. And by now, we completely ignore it. And I'm sorry to ramble here, but just, one of the things that I found most useful in reporting this book was this crazy website that, Carol, I'm sure you're familiar with, called the Trump Twitter Archive. And it has all of the tweets and it's searchable. It's a really wonderful resource. And when you look at the craziness that has been on display on Twitter, most of which at this point, we just sort of ignore, that's just Trump. But I tried to point out throughout the book what Trump was really saying and thinking through his Twitter feed. And the outrageousness and the ability to be shocked is something I tried to maintain throughout this work, because it's really shocking.
I think you're absolutely right about the way it's so shocking on a daily, hourly basis, and we've become inured to it. Let's get into the book then. You know, in a way, you start, the book opens with a very, very compelling scene of Mueller meeting Trump for the first time, and ultimately, as you say, the last time. Um, the book really begins chronologically a little bit before that, and that is a panicked FBI. They are realizing that the FBI director has been fired. They are worrying about what to do, to the point that, as you reveal, they begin hiding documents about the ongoing investigation they launched during 2016, documents about Russian intervention in the election and the possible coordination or ties to key Trump campaign figures. Take us to that moment. Tell us a little bit about why they were so panicked, and was it rational or logical to be that frightened at that moment in May 2017?
Well, I think this is a good example of how, the repetition of Trump's behavior has inured us to the shock value. But if we can all get back in our heads to May of 2017, only less than 4 months into Donald Trump's presidency, he fires Jim Comey. Let's remember that, as a result of J. Edgar Hoover's, overlong tenure, the Congress set a term limits for FBI directors, 10-year terms that were supposed to insulate them from political pressure. I mean, the whole point of the 10-year term was that they served for multiple presidents. And yes, it is true that Bill Clinton fired William Sessions, but he had bipartisan support for that. It was a personal scandal. It was not anything controversial, frankly. But the idea that the president could fire the FBI director solely because he was investigating the president and the people around him, as was obvious from day one, really caused a level of shock, both outside the bureau, but inside the bureau. I mean, Jim Comey, as he has described in detail, including in his own book, I mean, he recognized he was off to a rocky start with Trump, but it didn't really occur to him that he was actually going to be fired, because it was the kind of thing that just wasn't done. And when you saw the way Trump behaved in firing him, this incredibly callous way of just announcing it while Comey was in Los Angeles for a training session, outraged that the acting director, the deputy, Andrew McCabe, allowed Comey to fly back on the FBI plane. Trump wanted him to have to fly commercial back to Washington. It created a sense at the FBI that anything was possible, that the president, if he could fire the FBI director, he could also shut down the investigation of the Russia matter. And that's what led Andy McCabe, the acting director, to do two things. One was he actually opened a criminal investigation of obstruction of justice of the president. And that allowed him to take Comey's memos, his memos of these conversations, and put them in what's called Sentinel, which is the FBI's sort of evidence computer program. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, they thought, who the hell knows? Maybe he'll shut down the Sentinel investigation. So they literally took physical copies of these Comey memos and stashed them around the FBI. Was it an overreaction? Not really. I don't think so. I mean, I thought it was it was a reasonable response to the level of craziness that was apparent. Now, it is true that the president did not shut down the Russia investigation, and Rod Rosenstein the following week did hire Mueller, and Mueller got access to that evidence. But I don't think it was an overreaction.
And do you think Rod Rosenstein was up to this moment? Your book describes him with more detail than others. Others have reported on this before. Our book talks a little bit about it, but you have some nice new details about how flummoxed and emotionally not weepy, how emotionally unstable this whole period of time was for Rod Rosenstein in the eyes of Andrew McCabe. Was Rod Rosenstein up for this? Was he in this incredibly contested dispute over who said what? Was he really proposing to wear a wire for the president's investigation?
Well, this one of the things I love about being a journalist is complications and difficulty and ambiguity. And one of the reasons I enjoyed writing about Rosenstein so much is that, he is not a cartoon figure. He is a relatively ordinary person who is thrust into a deeply bizarre circumstance. But, one of the key facts about Rosenstein, which I think doesn't get enough attention, is that when Barack Obama became president, he did, as presidents do, he replaced every United States attorney in the country, except one, Rod Rosenstein. Rod Rosenstein was the only US attorney to survive from the George W. Bush tenure to the Obama tenure. And that suggested to me that this, this fellow, who was not particularly political, had bureaucratic survival skills that were really put to the test in his 2+ years as Deputy Attorney General. But to answer your question directly, I think he was deeply traumatized by what happened. And just to, as my father used to say, to make a long story unbearable, Rosenstein was asked to prepare a memo about Comey's tenure as FBI director. He didn't really quite understand why, but he did it for the president. And he learned the next day that the memo was being used as a justification to fire Comey, which was not something that the memo even called for. It was a memo critical of Comey's performance in the
Clinton matter.
Clinton investigation. And Rosenstein recognized that he'd been used, and he recognized that he was dealing with a deeply unethical White House. And this led to a series of conversations between him and McCabe, and in one of which he did suggest the idea that he might wear a wire or recruit cabinet members for the invocation of the 25th Amendment. Now,
wait, I'm gonna interrupt you right there. I'm gonna be a reporter and say, you were a line prosecutor. Do you think any boss of yours on an investigation could legally, appropriately, properly wear a wire in an investigation they were responsible for supervising?
No. There were two no's in answer to that question. No, I don't think. The idea that a supervisor could also be a witness, and one of the sort of mysterious aspects, something that never really got enough attention, I think, was the fact that Rosenstein was supervising the Mueller investigation at a time when he was a fact witness in the Mueller investigation. I mean, and I think basically they allowed that to happen, and Democrats didn't complain about it because they thought, well, Rosenstein's as good as we're going to get, and we don't really trust anyone else in the Justice Department, so we're not going to make a stink over it. But it was a really bizarre scenario. But
Now I'm gonna cut you off. Here's why, because I realize how many people have questions for you, and I'm gonna skirt us to the next couple and then ask their questions.
Okay.
I would love to hear a little bit about the two mistakes you feel and report in great detail that Mueller's team made. One, not subpoenaing the president for an interview, and second, not seeking his tax returns. There's another investigative issue later we'll get to, trust me, but those two big investigative steps. The president, the deputy attorney general's mandate to Mueller as special counsel was any and all ties or relationships between Russian figures and the state and the Trump campaign. Would not tax returns be a piece of incredible information about whether or not there were ties? I mean, Robert Mueller sure looked at Manafort and Gates's tax returns.
Maybe. I mean, I have to say, of those two issues you raised, the failure to subpoena and the failure to subpoena Trump for testimony, and the failure to look at the tax returns and financial records, I am very critical of the failure to subpoena. I have to say, I understand why they didn't go deeper into Trump's financial background, including the tax returns. I mean, I think other prosecutors might have reached a different judgment. But I mean, you read, because you're a good reporter, you read the exact jurisdiction that Mueller had. It did not say anything about Trump's personal finances. It was really not included. It was about the campaign activities. Now, you might say, well, what was, and the question that continues to hang over much of this case and much of the Trump presidency is, what is it about Russia that leads the president never to complain about Vladimir Putin, never to criticize Putin, bend over backwards to diminish Putin's role in helping him get elected president? So I mean, there is this mystery about Trump's relationship with Russia. But, there was no evidence that Trump cheated on his taxes. I mean, there really was none that Mueller.
No, but if you're a prosecutor, as you were, most prosecutors in like about 4 days would have gotten the tax returns of anybody who's the target of their investigation on the grounds that you need to know everything you can about the person.
It is. I'm not sure everyone would have. I mean, tax returns are a little different than. I mean, yes. As a former prosecutor, we subpoena bank records, we subpoena phone records as a matter of course. Tax returns are a little more unusual. But one of the things that I think is very important to remember about the Mueller investigation is that he was a special counsel, an employee of the Department of Justice. He was not an independent counsel like Kenneth Starr or Lawrence Walsh, who had an independent legal basis for their investigations. Every time Mueller stepped outside his exact jurisdiction, he had to go to Rosenstein and ask permission, and he would have had to get permission for a subpoena, and he would have had to get permission to get the tax returns. Rosenstein never told Mueller no, but it was something Mueller was always worried about, that he was going to push Rosenstein too far. And I think it was a reasonable judgment that the financial records and the tax returns were a step too far. Just to go to, I mean, and you also mentioned, and I can go into this if you want, or you can go into another question. The subpoena was an out and out blunder on Mueller's part. And I think, and it's a big part of my book, it's a saga, the negotiations over the subpoena that go on for months through many defense lawyers, through John Dowd, through Jay Sekulow, through Rudolph Giuliani, through Jane and Marty Raskin, the Miami lawyers who were much less known to the public, all of whom played an important part of this, and frankly outmaneuvered Mueller on these issues. But anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
What do you think about whether or not there was complete agreement on the Mueller team with their boss, for example, on the subpoena for the interview, and for example, on the most dramatic decision that Mueller made, which was his team gathered overwhelming evidence in at least 4 cases, 4 acts by the president that they would have normally charged obstruction of justice, would have indicted him if he were not a sitting president. That's what the evidence showed. The report never said that out loud. What did you find about whether or not there were any disappointed, regretful Mueller team members?
Well, by Washington standards, where disloyalty to the boss is pretty common, and carping at the boss for decisions made, especially after the fact, is a frequent pastime. I found a lot more unanimity than dissent within the Mueller office. I mean, they are extremely loyal to Robert Mueller, whom they regard as an extremely honorable person, and someone who did his best under difficult circumstances. There were somewhat hawks and doves in that office. The leader of the Russia team, someone whose name almost never appeared in public during this investigation, someone who's an important person in my book, Jeannie Rhee, a lawyer who worked with Mueller at the Wilmer Hale firm. She's now at a different firm, but former Justice Department prosecutor. She ran the Russia investigation. And when you think about what they learned about the extent of the Russian efforts in the 2016 election, it's really a remarkable story. And the other person was Andrew Weissman, who was much more of a target. He and I actually were in the same U.S. Attorney's office in Brooklyn. So Andrew, he has a book coming out shortly. But I've known him for a long time, and he's known as an extremely aggressive prosecutor. He led the Manafort investigation. And the Russia and Manafort investigations were a lot more hard-edged and aggressive than the White House investigation. The White House investigation, which was run by a guy named Jim Quarles, a contemporary of Mueller's, who was also from Wilmer Hale, many years ago worked on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force. They were somewhat more deferential, and they were in charge of the subpoena dispute. And I think, if the roles had been reversed, if Rhee and Weissman had been in charge of the White House investigation, things might have gone differently. But I don't want to give the impression that the Mueller office was like a hotbed of infighting. This was a pretty loyal and
cohesive
loyal place to the boss.
And the restraint that you described so well in your book in detail, the restraint they showed over and over again, it's so contrary to the way in which the president and his allies depicted this investigation: a group of angry Democrats, a witch hunt, pulling every punch, conflicts of interest galore, trying to just get the president on anything they could. But the Southern District of New York, often known as the Sovereign District of New York, they had an opportunity to investigate the Trump Organization. Tell us a little bit about why that didn't really go very far.
Well, it's fascinating to me that, one of the things, I don't like to preen about being a former prosecutor. In the first place, it was quite a long time ago. And I don't think prosecutors are a flawless group by any means, but there are certain cultural norms that I think prosecutors feel. And the fact that Mueller recruited almost exclusively from current or former prosecutors had a big effect on how they did their job. Prosecutors are not investigative reporters. We look for interesting stories, and we cast our net widely, and we report things, and we don't have a proof beyond a reasonable doubt standard. I mean, we're very committed to telling the truth, but we realize that we don't have subpoena power, and we do the best with what we have. Prosecutors, career prosecutors believe in the idea that you don't do anything that you can't prove in a courtroom. And it is true that a lot of the members of the staff gave money to Democrats over the years. But the fact that they were prosecutors was much more important. And so they were not out there fishing for any bad thing they could find about Donald Trump. They were looking for provable crimes. And I think that was true in the Southern District as well. The Southern District also was highly affected by the Office of Legal Counsel opinion, which said, as many people may remember, that under Department of Justice policy, which is binding on the Southern District of New York and binding on Robert Mueller as a subordinate of the Attorney General, sitting presidents cannot be indicted. The Southern District was not going to investigate someone who couldn't be indicted anyway, especially since the Southern District didn't have any sort of jurisdiction over the president. So, one of the things I say in the book that, I think many people did not realize at the time, that the Southern District investigation of Michael Cohen, the president's personal lawyer, was an investigation of Michael Cohen. It was not an investigation of Donald Trump. And they beat the hell out of Michael Cohen. They prosecuted him for all sorts of different things, bank fraud, and ultimately the sexiest case was the illegal campaign contributions related to the Stormy Daniels money. But they were not out there fishing for bad information about Donald Trump because they couldn't have done anything with it anyway.
I have a lot of questions from our audience. This one's interesting. I'm going to simplify it a little. What do you make of Mueller shrugging his shoulders at finding that Manafort and Gates, the two political advisors, had given all this Trump polling data to Konstantin Kilimnik, a character a lot of us at the Washington Post spent a lot of time on, a likely conduit to Russian intelligence? It seems like, this was part of, could have been helpful to a social media campaign. Is this an example of Mueller bending over backwards to avoid or just sidestep potential evidence of collaboration between the Trump campaign and Russia?
Well, again, here's where I think the prosecutorial mentality comes in. It was shameful, and it was revealing about Manafort that he did this, and this bleeds forward to the Ukraine story. But is there evidence that Trump knew about that exchange of information? Is there evidence that Trump authorized it? I don't think so. I didn't see it. Mueller didn't find it. And so, shrugging your shoulders I don't think he shrugged his shoulders, but Manafort never told Trump, never told Mueller's investigators during his abortive cooperation that there was any sort of authorization from Trump. And it goes, the same goes for the infamous June 2016 meeting between the high command of the Trump campaign and the Russian lawyer with the famous Rob Goldstone email, part of the Russian government's help for your campaign. I mean, you could hardly have a more explicit email than that. But if you were a prosecutor, you have to ask yourself, what is the proof that Trump knew about this meeting, authorized this meeting, learned about this meeting? Donald Trump Jr. didn't cooperate. Jared Kushner said he didn't tell Trump about it. There was no clear follow-up from that meeting. So it was kind of a dead end. Same thing with, Roger Stone and his inquiries about WikiLeaks and the hacking information. Was there any sort of meeting of the minds between the Trump campaign, Trump himself and WikiLeaks or anyone doing the hacking? No proof of it. So, I don't think Mueller was shrugging his shoulders. I think he came to an evidentiary dead end on those issues.
On the Stone one, he almost came to the end of the clock running down on him because, there was a lot of obfuscation and obstruction to answer the questions. Let me ask you something else. In the book, you talk about, and I think it's very compelling, about how Mueller's team just didn't seem to get that this was such a politicized moment, and that Bill Barr, the new attorney general, who was going to handle essentially the transmittal of their investigation, the findings, that Bill Barr was a political animal. I wonder, how could the Mueller team have missed those many, many clues and cues about how politicized Donald Trump had made every part of the executive branch?
Well, here's where I think Mueller's character and background really tells you a lot. I mean, Robert Mueller, is an institutionalist. He has spent his entire life working and devoted to institutions that he believes are forces for good. Three in particular: the Marine Corps, the United States Department of Justice, and the FBI. And he is dedicated to, he's someone who talks about the mission, the mission of these groups. And I think Mueller did not get at all. And even when it was staring him in the face, even when I mean, the denouement of the Mueller investigation really is sort of like a tragedy to me, because you see Barr and his advisors just running rings around Mueller and minimizing his conclusions. And Mueller never puts up a fight. He writes this very bland letter of protest, which he doesn't leak to the press after Barr's infamous press conference in March. He makes a very bland final statement to the press, shutting down his investigations. And then he has this basically embarrassing appearance before the two House committees, where he doesn't engage with the members at all, or criticize Barr. And I think that comes from his sort of institutional duty to the Department of Justice, and his simply failure to recognize what that institution has become under Bill Barr. This is an area where, I can do nothing but blame Mueller, because some of these other things these are tough calls about how you go about an investigation. But when Bill Barr was abusing and misleading the public about your own investigation, to say nothing and do nothing in response was really, I think, an abdication on Mueller's part, and I think a rare stain on his legacy.
And how damaging was that for the public? I mean, on the one hand, as a reader, as a member of the audience points out, so few Americans read the Mueller Report, even though it was a best-selling book when we reprinted it at the Washington Post. So few people read it. They relied on Bill Barr. What was the damage to the country that Mueller was an institutionalist? All the lieutenants around him were blindly loyal to him to the point of saying nothing. What was the damage to our country that those damning pieces of evidence of criminal misconduct were not shouted out?
Well, I think some of the fault goes to Mueller himself in the way he wrote the report. And you hinted at this earlier. One of my two main criticisms in the book are the failure to subpoena and the failure to state clearly in the report that the president committed the crime of obstruction of justice, which I thought Mueller proved clearly. But when it came to his conclusions, he wrote this gobbledygook about, we would exonerate him, but we can't exonerate him. It was like a quadruple negative sentence that was very hard to parse. So I think Mueller allowed, by failing to speak clearly in his conclusions, he opened the door to Barr's outright distortions of his findings. But what was the cost? I think if Mueller had spoken clearly, Trump would have been impeached earlier. I think the obstruction of justice alone was so compelling that Nancy Pelosi, who was basically against impeachment almost to the bitter end, would have been forced to proceed. Would it have led 67 senators to vote against the president? Absolutely not. So I don't think there was any scenario, given the contemporary Republican Party, that Trump was ever going to be removed from office by the Senate. But I do think that impeachment would have proceeded earlier if Mueller had spoken clearly about what his evidence showed.
I want to jump, because you just provide me with such a perfect segue to the Ukraine portion of your book, but I'm going to ask an audience member's question while we're still on this topic. In the recent news, we've had a court rule that McGahn does have to comply with a subpoena. This is the White House counsel, who was literally at the epicenter of 4 of the obstruction episodes and a witness to them as well. How important is that now? It seems like so long ago.
This is a great example of how the Trump administration won by losing. That, when the Democrats retook the House in the midterm elections, a lot of us naively said, wow, there are going to be a lot of investigations and there are going to be subpoenas and people are going to testify and they're going to get documents. And again, what we learned in the violation of norms was that the president and his lawyers said, we're not cooperating. Sue us. So sue us. And eventually, there were some of these lawsuits, including the one about McGahn. And look what happened. Here it is in August of 2020. They still haven't gotten to McGahn. What the White House recognized is that the defiance worked. So much so, and it was so outrageous that it led to the less famous but still important second article of impeachment. The one that said, you simply can't defy Congress like this. And I think the president was quite properly impeached for it, but in the partisan environment, that one sort of fell out, and even Mitt Romney didn't vote to convict on that count. But I think, the lesson that the White House took was, you can defy Congress, you can defy the courts with impunity, and the courts work so slowly that even if you lose, as they have lost, what difference does it make? This case will not be resolved until after November, and it will be ancient history by that point.
And you've given me a perfect transition to Ukraine with that. The White House counsel, the new one, Pat Cipollone, and the president believed that they would use that same tactic in July of 2019. Literally the day after Bob Mueller testified in this halting and painful way, a way that made many of his friends turn off the television. They were so disconcerted by the person that they saw, who was not the take charge Marine they remember, not the FBI director they remember. The day after that, Trump celebrates his victory over the Mueller probe by calling the president of Ukraine and saying, I'd like you to do me a favor, though. The White House, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead, please.
No,
you didn't ask the question. I just started to talk, please.
That's a good conversation. We need to get some wine in here. So the moment that an investigation began of that, the White House is like, great, we'll just fend them off. But it was different this time. They weren't able to fend them off. In the Washington Post, we were expecting to get no records, no information. And lo and behold, career public servants were like, you know what? I got a subpoena. I got to go talk. And all the information started to come out. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The courage of the Alexander Vindmans and the Masha, I'm blanking on her name.
Yovanovitch. Masha Yovanovitch.
And Fiona Hill is a stirring thing, and something we Americans should be very proud of. But the proximity of Mueller's testimony and the infamous phone call, that's not a coincidence. This is what happens when bullies win, is they're emboldened. And this is what the failure of the Mueller investigation to leave a legacy, and Mueller's personal failure in front of Congress, emboldened the president to continue this this outrageous behavior with Ukraine. And I just think it's interesting in talking to people about this book. Most people want to talk about the Mueller stuff, but the Ukraine stuff is so much worse in many respects, because when you're talking about obstruction of justice, that's a garden variety crime that anyone can commit. Carol, you and I, given the opportunity, could obstruct justice. But you know what we couldn't do? We couldn't abuse the office of President of the United States. And if you look at Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers, if you look at the debates about the Constitution, this is why impeachment exists, to police abuses of power in the office of president. And when you see what Trump did in Ukraine, and it was not just the phone call, it was an entire course of conduct, particularly after the new president of Ukraine is elected in April of 2019, that President Zelensky, the coercion on an ally, a vulnerable ally, and the use of American tax dollars, this military aid, as a cudgel solely to get dirt on President Trump's likely political opponent. That to me is worse than the simple crime of obstruction of justice. And I'm with Mitt Romney. I was outraged by what I saw, and I think the fact that we were so inured to Trump's misdeeds is something that is really too bad. And we saw.
Well, I think of the two sort of central characters in both dramas. You have Don McGahn going to Steve Bannon after being bullied by the president to try to fire Mueller or call Rosenstein to fire Mueller. And he goes, I'm not putting up with this shit anymore. And then you have Alexander Vindman, about as low in the totem pole of the National Security Council as you can get, although quite experienced and an Iraq veteran, saying as soon as he hears what the president asks of the Ukraine president, oh my gosh, I think the president's engaged in a crime. He's asked a foreign power to investigate an American. And it's a slap in the face to all of us inured, hardened journalists when that person says this is likely a crime. I don't know if it's a crime, but I know it's wrong.
I know it's wrong. And the whistleblower, whose name we have never reported and who has never come forward. This whole story might not have come to light because remember, it was only the whistleblower that got Vindman into the public eye, and Fiona Hill and Masha Yovanovitch. Who knows whether any of this would have come to light without the whistleblower. The other thing that's worth noting is that for a White House that stonewalled on everything, to this day I'm amazed that they released the transcript of that call. And I think it shows what a cult the White House is, that they could read that transcript and think, oh, well, this proves our point. It was just amazing to me. And it was, one of the scenes that I liked in my book was when the staff of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff's staffers are reading, the transcript for the first time, and they're going like, how could they have released this? There's a wonderful, they cite a scene from The Wire where one drug dealer says to another, don't write down what you're doing, we're drug dealers. And I have a footnote in the book that has a link to the YouTube of that scene. I don't know if anybody's ever clicked on it, but I enjoyed writing that footnote.
There's so many connections to The Wire, right? I always think of Omar, you're going to come for the king, you best not miss. And two times people who have put their lives and their careers on the line to come at this king because they think he's crossed the line and it has cost them. And that brings me to Bill Barr and the politicization of this Justice Department. You worked there. I've covered it for a long, long time, have known so many amazing people that work there. The purity, the integrity, that the kind of breathlessness they feel when they walk into that building. How bad is it there now? And what's the consequence of what's been happening for the last 4 years? What are we not doing as a country that we should be doing, meaning as a Justice Department, because of what's happening?
Well, Carol, you were so right. And journalists, we're trained to be cynical and we're trained to, be suspicious about people's motives. But, when I was in AUSA in Brooklyn, which is, not a high level job, but a very responsible job. The only thing I was ever told was to do the right thing. There was never any sense that we were I was in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, as was the U.S. attorney was appointed by. But this idea that we were separate from politics was so ingrained. And when you see, Bill Barr, the only defendant in his entire tenure where he intervened to lower a sentence was Roger Stone. I've been asking around, I don't know if you ever found this, but I have never found a case where the Department of Justice had a defendant who pleaded guilty twice, and then they moved to overturn the conviction. That's what they did with Michael Flynn. Never in the history of the Department of Justice.
And by the way, I have looked into it, and it has never happened.
It's like never, right? And then, bringing all of his favorite U.S. attorneys from around the country, ordering them to reinvestigate all of Mueller's cases, including, John Durham, who presumably, will attack the FBI's original Russia investigation sometime on the eve of the election. I mean, it's just so shocking. And Barr has very clearly said, look, I'm 70 something years old. I'm never going to do this again. I'm not worried about my future. This is how I'm going to conduct myself as Attorney General. And, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing, and presumably until Election Day. But as someone who worked in that department and as you say, knew a lot of people in that department, it is really heartbreaking.
So if a president, as described so beautifully in your book, can get away with 4 provable acts of obstruction of justice and high crimes and misdemeanors, evidence galore, and asking a foreign power to investigate an American citizen and seeking political benefit from a foreign power, if that can happen, what's in store for us in the next 50 years of presidents?
I'm a little more concerned about what's in store for the next 4 years. Because, as I said earlier, this is bullies respond to stimuli. And if in light of all of this, Donald Trump gets reelected, we will see this in an even more exaggerated form. And I think that is the immediate issue. Whether he gets reelected in light of all of this. If he doesn't get reelected, I think there will be some reevaluation of how the presidents are supposed to conduct themselves. And, I don't want to pretend that prior presidents of either party were angels, but we are in a quantum difference in the politicization of the Justice Department and in the absence of integrity in the White House. I think the verdict is really going to come on November 3rd. I mean, that's the real verdict on this administration. And I don't know what that verdict will be, but that's what really matters.
I've so enjoyed this, Jeff. Thank you so much for answering these questions from the audience and from pesky, nerdy me. And now it's Brad's turn, I think, to say goodbye to you. I know you've got other appointments. Thank you so much on behalf of Politics
Thank you,
and Prose.
Carol, both for your questions and the example of your work. I mean that seriously.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I mean, it's clear that the two of you, if we had the time, could go on talking about these momentous investigations for hours. And it's also clear that Jeffrey's book has so much illuminating and revealing detail in it that everyone should read it in order to better understand just what happened and why. Again, the title of Jeffrey's book is True Crimes and Misdemeanors. Here's what the cover looks like. And you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we posted in the chat column. Thanks again to everyone for tuning in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thanks.